Hi, everyone. Now we're going to look at what's called the neo-charismatic or third wave renewal. Um, Generally, a lot of people point to Peter Wagner as as really one of the pioneers of this movement. Certainly, he's the one that coined the phrase "third wave" in 1983. He also co-led a course at Fuller Seminary on power evangelism with John Wimber that became enormously popular and became very influential in shaping many future leaders of this movement. John Wimber, at the same time, also started a Calvary Chapel church that became one of the founding churches of the Vineyard movement or network of churches. Um, Scholars such as David Barrett suggest that one of the defining characteristics of the neo-charismatic movement is its appearance in indigenous networks throughout the world. He gives examples that date back to the 17th and 18th centuries of Caribbean indigenous networks that really were some of the earliest pioneers of the neo-charismatic movement. They expressed a lot of charismatic or charismata in their services, and also later led to other renewals, such as the East African revival that I think I referred to last week, which started in 1927 and led to 50 million people in East Africa coming to Christ. One of the other factors that isn't generally pointed out, I think one of your textbooks mentions this, but there were scandals in the later 80s that also led to the promotion of the neo charismatic, or preferably, most people called it the third wave movement. Scholars often call it the neo charismatic movement. And part of the reason is they wanted to disassociate themselves from the Pentecostal and charismatic movement, largely because of these scandals, led sadly by these two people, Jimmy Swaggart and Jim Bakker and his wife, Tammy Faye Bakker. Um, you know, um, Jimmy Swaggart, a lot of people don't realize um, that his television program was actually at the height of his popularity before the scandal was watched by 10% of the world's population. It was enormously influential. And so when the scandal occurred, it led to some significant shifts in the way some churches, while they still wanted to have the freedom to express spiritual gifts and have freedom in worship, they wanted to disassociate or distance themselves in many ways from the charismatic and Pentecostal movements. Um, some other characteristics of the neo-charismatic movement: they exhibited a wide variety of charismata or spiritual gifts, certainly like the Pentecostal and charismatic movement that preceded them, but they don't necessarily separate spirit baptism from conversion. They don't necessarily identify with the Pentecostal or charismatic movement, and also, in addition to disassociating themselves from that movement, often reject their terminology, such as glossolalia or speaking in tongues being a requirement for spirit baptism. They are most often seen in indigenous networks of churches, and also have helped lead to the rise of what's called the post-denominational movement. Um, they also emphasize and value relationship more than structure. And perhaps part of that is a natural reaction to the scandals of the 1980s. Let's look at a few examples of different types of neo charismatic churches. First of all, let's look at the church that sponsors our seminary, King Seminary. I think a really good example of what I would categorize, and many others would categorize as a neo charismatic or third wave church. I don't know if they identify themselves as that. I don't see it in their website, but I think scholars would probably put them in this category. And part of that is simply because they value relationship. They set up an organizational structure that is not connected by denominations, but that one of the characteristics of third wave churches is generally they tend to emphasize the fivefold ministry groups mentioned in Ephesians 4, the apostolic, the evangelistic, the prophetic. the pastor and the teacher. And but that's been a predominant characteristic of a lot of neo-charismatic and third-wave churches. Um, One other characteristic, and again, these are all, there's a wide variety of neo-charismatic churches. Many of them also have a tendency to promote health and well-being, also categorized often as prosperity churches. These are most popular in Asia and Africa, although many of them started in North America. So a good example of that is Joseph Prince's church, New Creation Church in Singapore. And uh, probably another, from a different spectrum, probably another church that wouldn't identify themselves as charismatic or Pentecostal and may not necessarily uh, identify themselves in the category I'm talking about, is a large church that my daughter and son-in-law go to in Tualatin, Oregon, called Athey Creek Christian Fellowship. They have a strong evangelical emphasis on Scripture, but they're still open and often express spiritual gifts in some of their smaller meetings. But anyway, also I would say Calvary Chapel churches like that are often in this particular subcategory. Another category would be churches uh, that reflect both a wide variety and frequent charismatic gifts. I would include Bethel Church in Redding, California, as a very popular leading church in this area. Expressing a variety of spiritual and manifestations, that some of us have heard of or talked about. Some groups dismiss them, and other groups promote them. Things like laughing, or crying, or barking, or just all sorts of a variety of spiritual manifestations. Interestingly, even though some of these may not be necessarily ones that are expressed in Scripture, we see them expressed at different points in history. Um, Another category that's widely talked about among scholars are, for example, African indigenous or self-identifying churches. There's a wide variety of these churches, not only in Africa, but especially in Africa. They display a broad spectrum of Christianity, spiritual gifts, and sometimes heterodox or unorthodox beliefs, some that would put them on the fringes or borders of Christianity. Um, House churches in China, persecuted churches, often are frequently express charismata and also strong relationships. Um, the global projections for this movement, and all three of these movements, just 15 years ago, David Barrett said there were 523 million renewal Christians in the world. He estimates that by 2025, just 8 years away, that nearly a billion people in the world will be identified as renewal Christians. And if that current trend continues by 2050, they will represent a majority of Christianity. It is a growing, in fact, the fastest growing segment of Christianity in the world today. Look forward to talking next about modern evangelicalism.